Okay, this is part two, as we say, of the residential purchase agreement installation and workshop. The reason we call it an installation is we want to install this in you. And it's a lot different than just doing a brief overview of what the different sections mean. So with no further ado, let's see if I can get my tech glitch out of the way. There we go. One thing I wanted to bring up in the contract is always watch out for the little details. I had a phone call yesterday from an agent, one of our agents, who said he caught something just in time. And what that was is the seller or the buyer made an offer on the listing, on his listing, and it said in the fine print, seller to pay for all repairs, just like that's all. You almost missed that. Everything else looked good. What could potentially happen there?
Well, you've got basically an open blank check there.
Yeah. And so that kind of stuff happens, and you probably don't want it to happen to you. So here's a quick example of watching the details.
Please. You just want me to come running up to kick that ball so you can pull it away and see me land flat on my back and kill myself. This time you can trust me. See, here's a signed document testifying that I promised not to pull it away. It is signed. It's a signed document. I guess if you have a signed document in your possession, you can't go wrong. This year I'm really gonna kick that football.
Yay!
Peculiar thing about this document, it was never notarized.
Okay. So watch the details. Watch the details.
Oh, Aiden, get up.
Okay. Here we go. Let's start out with a quick review of last week, a very quick review. Is everybody up for that? Please feel free to just speak up. And if you want to, if you have yourself on mute, if you press the space bar on your computer, it acts like a walkie-talkie. Space bar down, you're unmuted. Let go of the space bar, you become muted again, if you didn't know that. So here we go. Quick review. When is it okay to provide dual agency? Anyone? When is it okay?
When all parties agree.
Yeah. In writing. In writing. And that is that disclosure and consent to represent multiple buyers and sellers. It's a required form. Can a listing agent disclose the terms of your offer to competing buyers? Yes or no? Anyone? Yes, they can. But it's not customary in our market, nor is it considered good practice. And to me, it's questionable on the ethics, but it is perfectly okay to do so. So be careful. At what point should you provide proof of funds to close? Anyone? At what point should that be provided?
When you make an offer?
Absolutely. Same time. Technically in the contract, it says you have up to 3 days, whatever, but most sellers or most listing agents are going to require that you present that at the same time. What's a standard time frame for a loan contingency? That should be an easy one. How many days?
17.
21. Appraisal is 17. 21 days. Maximum amount that a buyer can receive as a credit to closing when there's a loan present. What is that? Typically, it's up to the amount of the buyer's closing costs. But the best practice is always check with the lender before you do this. They might say, well, you can only do up to $12,000 and you've got a credit for $15,000 all negotiated. Well, the seller is entitled to keep that $15,000, that other $3,000. So be cautious. Check with the lender. In case of buyer contingency to sell their own home, okay, in a contingency, what's the procedure after the seller accepts a backup offer? You represent the buyer. What does the seller do? That procedure. They got an accepted backup offer that is not contingent. Anyone? Okay. This is it. Immediately, you give written notice to the buyer to remove this contingency and the loan contingency too, and also provide verification of funds to close. Oh, I'll remove it. Well, show me you have the cash to close. And the buyer has 3 days to do so. That's the danger of when you're in a contingency. So speaking of contingencies again, as the market gets a little different, you may see more and more of these, by the way. What is the delayed right to notify buyer? What does that mean? I'm so glad you asked. Basically, it says the seller shall not invoke the notice that we just mentioned in the previous question for a set amount of time or during the entire term of the residential purchase agreement, whichever is agreed to. As a buyer, you want to make sure you get at least a good amount of time in there. It reduces the risk to your buyer. As a seller or a listing agent, you might want to minimize that. Choices are up to a certain amount of days or during the whole term of the agreement. Okay. So let's get back on track with new stuff. Okay. Starting with, as we go through this, there's a lot of references to different instruments. We call them take action instruments. One is a notice to buyer to perform. One is a notice to seller to perform. One is an extension of time addendum. These are things that come up frequently. Okay. I want to go through those a little bit right now if we can. Let's starting with the notice to the buyer to perform. Okay, it's a single sheet of paper. It looks something like that. Okay, and let's just break it down a little bit. On that notice to buyer to perform. In essence, the seller is giving the buyer notice to remove a contingency, a specified contingency, or take contractual action. And it's going to be checked off here. Maybe they want to all contingencies removed. Maybe they just want the loan removed, just the appraisal. Maybe just the buyer's investigation of property condition. Maybe the COP form, the sale of buyer's property contingency, or contractual action. Maybe we don't have the deposit yet. Notice to perform, give me that deposit. The increased deposit that was agreed to wasn't done. So on and so forth. There's all these different things. And so the seller is telling the buyer, you need to get this stuff done. Because if you don't, this happens. Within 2 days, I can cancel. That's the notice. Simple, right? That's the notice to perform. The buyer notice to perform. Now, some realtors issue these very routinely, right? And some never issue them at all. And that's the same in every market. Just don't get your feelings hurt and be prepared for it, because I've some of the agents that do regardless. On day 15, you're going to get a notice to perform contingencies if you haven't removed them yet. And it's like, why are you being so aggressive? Maybe that's just the way they do business. And others say, no, I want to be nice. I don't want to get anybody upset, all that. Best practice is just tell the other agent up front how you work. And hopefully you might want to find out how they work too. But it's a routine document. Now there's a conflict between the notice to buyer to perform and the COP, which is the contingency to sell the buyer's property. In the contingency to sell the buyer's property, there's 3 days to perform. However, in the notice to perform, it's only 2 days. And that's the document you issue to provide notice. So if you have a COP, just a little thing is you may want to address that in the original residential purchase agreement to prevent conflict and misunderstandings later. I don't know why CAR hasn't corrected that, but it's been an issue for a long time. So that will solve that. It gives you an additional day if you represent the buyer and you have a contingency to sell a home. That clear? Yep. Okay. This is detail we might never have uncovered before. Notice the seller perform. Has anyone ever given one of those out? Anybody can speak up anytime, by the way. So notice the seller perform. Obviously, it's very similar to notice the buyer perform. Basically, it's contractual action and potential contingencies. For example, we don't have the report that was promised. We don't have the statutory disclosures, TDS, that sort of thing yet. I need them. We don't have a, we ask for disclosure of insurance claims. I need them. So on and so forth. Contractual or contingencies that a seller may have, they may have in the contract included the SPRP, which says this is contingent upon me finding a replacement property. Or the other, or basically of closing a replacement property. I'm giving you notice to perform to remove that. And same rights. If you don't take contractual actions within the 2 days, then the buyer can cancel. Now you're going to say, I don't want to cancel. Buyer probably doesn't want to cancel. And so this part gets a little tricky sometimes, but in 95% of the cases, the agents are going to cooperate very fully. And sometimes we say, that's a bad agent. They're not cooperating. Sometimes it's not the agent that's the bad agent. Sometimes it's the client who's being uncooperative and the agent's doing the best they can. Always keep that in mind. When you got a difficult other side of the transaction, it's not always the agent. Sometimes it is. I'll say that. But it is the seller notice to perform is used much less frequently than the buyer notice to perform. Absolutely is. And keep in mind, while notice to perform instruments are very efficient, be mindful and be courteous. You're probably not going to have a good relationship with the other agent if you keep just knocking these and throwing them out there. So just be careful with them. And without utilizing the notice to perform, keep in mind, neither party is forced to remove any contingencies, and the time frames just go on and on and on. So on that 17-day investigation, if the contingencies haven't been removed, you can say remove them. They could say, no, I don't want to. They don't have to. Given notice to perform, they have to. Okay. The third action instrument, the extension of time addendum. Most of us are fairly familiar with this, I think. The piece that really applies, it's used if you see there's going to be delays. For example, you need a follow-up well inspection and you're not going to have it done by day 17, right? Boy, something's coming up with the loan. The appraisal's so slow, I'm not going to be able to get the appraisal done in the 17 days. You're going to ask for, or I can't close on time, whatever, anything, whether it's a extension of closing up here, whether it's extension of the contingencies, or extension for anything, because the whole contract, the whole residential purchase agreement is based on time is of the essence, right? Okay. So you're asking for that extension, and keep in mind, the other party is under no obligation to agree or even to respond to it. You could give it to them and they could say, okay, I'm going to give it to my seller. They don't have to do anything. If they can ignore you if they want. Hopefully they don't. And also it's a good idea to get ahead of those extensions. If you know on day 10 that you're not going to have your inspections done in the 17 days, you may want to do this ahead of time to maybe it's going to take a little bit of negotiation to get that extra time. Other schools of thoughts in certain situations is wait till later to pressure the party to take it. It's going to be, I can't tell you how to do it other than the first option is usually better. But once in a while, you're going to know the other side and how they work, and you're going to know your client, how they work. It can be used as a leverage tool to get what you need. You're going to get that with experience. Okay. Any questions on any of this? Any comments? Okay. All righty. Let's jump right back into the residential purchase agreement then. What we covered so far last week were the basics, agency, the money, and we went through a contingency for sale of a buyer's home, right? Okay. Starting today, we're going by section. There's 32 sections in the contract. We're on section 5, addendum advisories. We've all seen this. Basically, this is checked off for you already, the buyer inspection advisory, okay? Anything on here that is applicable to the contract, if you check it off and you fill out the document, it becomes part of the contract. If you don't check it off and you, for example, I don't know, if it's a short sale, if it's a probate, if for the septic well and property monument addendum, if you don't check it, but you include the document, they're under no obligation to accept that as part of the contract. So make sure this, you know that this incorporates it. I like to do the market conditions advisory as well. That'll come way later in the workshop. But check it off, they're part of the contract. Any questions? Okay, got it quite good. Other terms, section 6. Other terms. Everyone familiar with this little piece? It's like 4 lines of blankness, right? And it is not a written invitation to just kind of, forget the fact we have a promulgated document, which means it was basically produced by CAR and their attorneys. That is not what it is at all. Other terms is other terms that you can't find a form for, or you can't adjust or adapt or delete or omit within the contract itself. So basically terms are added, terms are removed, or terms are modified from the existing contract. Okay. Credits to buyer might go there. Use it sparingly. Use it very sparingly. Why would you want to be cautious with this piece of the contract?
Because you could be practicing law.
We think alike, Simeon. You're absolutely right. Because it is illegal. The unauthorized practice of law is something that will get you in some big trouble. Big trouble. So be cautious. If there's anything that's not just basic, like buyer contingency period to be 10 days instead of 17, that's okay. But if you're going to put something in, you're going to add something that could possibly border on that, check with your broker. If you are the broker and you're not sure, I would check with Car Legal at least. Okay. On to section 7, which is cost allocations. Technically, all of this is negotiable. That's why you have both a buyer's box and a seller box. But there's local custom, whatever market you're in. And, but it is negotiable. And all this section it says who pays for what, right? And what it says is, for example, the natural hazard zone disclosure report, who's going to pay for that? Usually it's the seller. That's custom here, custom most everywhere. You want to put down who you want it prepared by. Some people put seller choice, some people put disclosure source, whatever. But put that in there. Who's going to pay for it? For example, this report here, City of Pacific Grove report inspection. Who's going to pay for that? Seller, probably. Government requirements and retrofit. Basically, it addresses the smoke alarm, carbon monoxide installation, and water heater bracing. The seller to not only provide the written statement of compliance, but to make sure that if it's not in compliance, that they pay to get it in compliance. That's virtually 100% paid for by the seller in this market. Okay. These are in Monterey County, these come up a lot. Other counties, they never come up. Part 1, who's going to pay for the cost of compliance with any minimum mandatory government inspections and reports? if it's required as a condition of closing. Most every city has their own little thing. Most time it's marked off by seller. If you don't mark anything and you forget, these things are going to come up and there's going to be a debate over who's going to pay for it. Hey, you didn't ask the seller to pay for it. I know that the seller usually does, but you didn't write the contract up that way. You figure it out. You know, and you're dealing with just a very small amount of money. You don't want to get into that situation. You don't. And this here is who's going to pay. And this includes like the sewer lateral, that sort of thing, the plumbing retrofit or whatever, if any of it applies to the city that you're selling in. How about the cost of compliance with that stuff right here? Who's going to pay for that? If you leave that blank, you're going to have a problem. But most often seller will pay, but it's negotiable. Very expensive mistakes are made here. And you also need to verify that that the reports are completed on time. Nothing worse than getting towards the end and nothing's even done or even ordered and nobody checked. Has that ever happened? Kent, has that ever happened anywhere?
Absolutely. Absolutely. Mm-hmm.
So you want to watch both your party, your responsibilities, if you represent the seller, and the other party's responsibilities, because closings can be delayed. Or let's say it's this is one that just happened recently. A year later, it was discovered that the sewer lateral repair was never done. And it was supposed to be the seller to pay for it. It was all agreed to in the contract. Never got done. Now there's a battle, $10,000 battle. And the seller, the listing side should have made sure it got done. Now, should the buyer side have made sure it got done too?
You
So
bet.
that second bit there, Mike, this is right now we got Pacific Grove, Monterey. Where else did it require a sewer lateral? Carmel, I think.
Carmel,
right? Yeah.
start.
So I am surprised. I made an offer last night on a place in Monterey, and the seller has not done the inspection. So it's like this is total unknown thing. I checked the box, that seller, but in the past I've had that box countered out. Mm-hmm. Both those boxes, because they say no, we're not going to pay. What if the government comes up with some standard in the middle of escrow here? We're not going to pay for it.
Sure.
And I don't blame the seller. I mean,
exactly, absolutely. It's all negotiable, and it's also part where if you put in very specifically sewer lateral, you can put that into other terms that the seller will pay for sewer lateral repair if necessary, or replacement if necessary. Cover your bases there, because you're right. That is an open-ended thing, and so you may need to be more specific for sure, but be cautious, and also be cautious of other agents who may not have quite the knowledge that I hope you walk away from during these 5 weeks. And good example, just this morning, one of our agents sent me an email saying that another agent who happens to be their own broker had this, question about it. It was wrong. They were wrong because the law was changed in January 2019 about agency, and they were insisting that that this occur. And so what I did is I just clipped out the little screenshot from the CR website and sent it to my agent, who sent it to the other broker agent, and now everybody's educated. But not everybody keeps up on stuff. And here's the thing. A big percent of agents don't even know the contract as it is. They figure I'll read it when it comes time, I'll read it then. And a bigger percentage, they don't know the updates to things. They're not keeping up with it. They're not looking at the legal updates. They're just kind of just getting through, and they do a deal or two a year, and just hope that their broker catches it. So just always this part right here, watch both sides of the fence, is pretty important in every aspect of the contract. Is you think they should be doing their job, they should be, but it's really part of your job representing your client's best interests to just, don't push them, don't be a jerk, but just verify that everything's getting done that needs to be getting done.
Speaking of sewer lateral, I just read last night the thing about in Monterey. The seller is required to fix the sewer lateral, do the inspection and fix it, per law in Monterey, or mandate or whatever. So if you check the buyer box for some reason, or you negotiate the buyer box on a sale in Monterey, the Monterey has a transfer of responsibility form.
Mhm.
So
Yeah.
probably got to check the local laws when you're dealing with this paragraph as well.
Oh yeah, we have a compliance guy that audits all of our files, 4 or 5 times before it closes, right? Alex Stripe, and he's constantly he's dealing with all these different cities, and he's constantly asking the questions and researching something, some specific detail that hasn't come up before. As he goes, he's making notes, so he's getting a database of those different special considerations. But there's a lot of them, and they change. That's the thing, they change. Back to who pays for what. Traditionally for escrow fee, it's usually split 50-50 buyer and seller. So you check both boxes and split 50-50 buyer and seller. Be very specific. If you just check both boxes, it's going to, well, who you're going to pay 75-25. I mean, 99% of the time it's assumed, but I like to go err on the side of caution. Name the title company here. Your preferred title company if you're the buyer. If the seller has a preference, you can, figure it out with the other agent. Most typically, the seller will pay for the owner's title insurance policy. Make sure you write down the name of the title company too. If there's a title insurance policy that insures the buyer's lender, that's typically paid for by the buyer by default. Okay, because it only benefits the buyer. County transfer tax, $1.10 per $1,000. That's most typically the seller. Sometimes that you'll put buyer on some of these to maybe if you want to make your offer more attractive. I don't know that a couple $100 on a $1.5 million sale is going to make it super attractive, but sometimes it shows that, hey, we're trying to do everything we can. If there's an HOA, be sure to address all this. Find out if you're not sure, just check out who you would prefer to pay for it. Oftentimes it's split 50-50 on these fees. Oftentimes the seller's going to pay for it. Depends, but just make sure. And you might, if you don't want to look like a rookie, you're not sure, just put if applicable. Home warranty. Different schools of thought. Sometimes the realtor does it as a closing gift. Sometimes it's split 50-50. Sometimes you ask for the seller to pay for it. But it's important enough that it's in the contract. And it's addressed pretty extensively in the contract. So let's just pretend that you want to split it 50-50, or you're asking the seller to pay for it. You're going to put in a price, what you don't want it to exceed, like maybe $550. If you're going to get pool spa, maybe make it $750. Become familiar with the different pricings. I promise if you call one of the reps, they will be all over you until give you anything you want. It's not often in most areas we have AC, but if it's there, make sure you check all this off. Write down who you want, American Home Shield, First American, whomever. However, if the buyer says, I don't want one, I don't need that, I don't believe in them, they're worthless, they're a waste of time. Some buyers think that. Some realtors think that. Make sure it's the buyer that thinks that, and they're not just getting your opinion. That's important if something goes south later. But if they waive it, they need to check the box. I waive the home warranty thing. They can still buy one if they want, but they're waiving it. They're saying that we're not going to get it. Now here, keep in mind, some E&O insurance policies will give you a reduced deductible if there's a home warranty plan in place and you're using current up-to-date CAR contracts and there's a home inspection. If all those things apply, it's important enough to them that they will reduce that maybe from a $10,000 deductible to from 5 to 25, whatever.
We should negotiate that.
Yeah, exactly. All right, moving on. That was that. Now we're going to go to section 8. Basically, what's included, what's excluded. What's included by default. What does the buyer want in addition to what's included by default? What's excluded by default, and what the buyer wants to hell out of there. Okay? This can be a hot spot of confusion if it's not handled properly up front. It really can. Seller wants to replace that beautiful chandelier that the buyer fell in love with a Home Depot light fixture. That ever happened to anybody? And that you didn't know about it till the final walkthrough? You've been doing this a while. It's happened. That sort of thing. So let's go into this. Breaking it up into little pieces like we do, little beats. Items included and excluded. So basically, as it's saying, this is the note to the buyer and the seller. Let me get myself a little more visual here. If it's listed as included or excluded in the MLS or the marketing or the flyers, doesn't matter. Doesn't matter. Okay. Get up here. The listings and flyers can be liars. If it's not in writing, it doesn't exist. It says in the MLS, refrigerator included. I don't need to check that box. Or the whole the home entertainment center, it's all included. The flyers, everything, all over the internet. If it's not written in as an inclusion, they can take it. It says right here, you're signing this. And the other part here is that initial, when the buyer and the seller talk, right? And they meet somehow, and the seller, oh yeah, I'll leave that for you. I'll leave the sofa, I'll leave the furniture, I'll leave the lawnmower and the garden equipment and all that. Does that love fest ever sour? Do they suddenly go from loving each other to just say they don't want to talk? Yes, it can. And so handle all this at offer time when everybody still loves each other. That's why I say if you're a seller or a listing agent and you're figuring out when to do the seller disclosures, do them really close to the signing of the listing agreement while they still love you and the house hasn't been on the market forever. Do it when they love you. So this, handle it at offer time. If it's something that's not, like some people ask for just lawnmowers or the riding tractor, that sort of thing. Okay. So these are the things that are by default included. Obviously, things that are attached to the property, fixtures and fittings. Okay. The existing electrical, mechanical, so on and so forth. Keep in mind over here, gas logs.
At gmail.com.
Okay. That is a gas logs and grates. Those get taken. You have a seller, everybody needs to know no, those stay because they're part of the fireplace. Another area of misunderstanding, window coverings, shutters, those nice plantation shutters. You don't put mini blinds up in their place, right? In-ground landscaping, you think, of course, they're not going to take that. But has it ever happened? I just planted those shrubs. I just planted all that. I'm going to take it to my new house. Check, all stoves, maybe except if there's a portable thing on there. If the buyer wants to request the refrigerator, that needs to be checked. It doesn't stay automatically because it's not attached. It's movable, and it's all refrigerators except the one in the garage, maybe, whatever. All stoves except for that one that's in the spare room. All washers and dryers, if they want it, they need to check. It's not a fixture. Any additional items, this is where you put stuff in there. Do this. Keep in mind, if there's any leases, like alarm systems and that sort of thing, be careful. Everybody needs to know. $1 million transactions have turned into battlegrounds over a $500 light. And I've seen them fall apart. So just be very clear. If you represent the seller, what stays. Be very clear when you represent the buyer, what wouldn't stay. And if you want it, we need to ask for it. Okay. Items excluded. These are things that don't get included in the sale. Audio and video, like flat screen TVs, speakers. Okay. If it's not attached to the property, it doesn't have to stay. Furniture obviously doesn't stay. If the buyer wants the speakers, even if they're bolted in, she needs to write it down in the previous section. And here's a good rule of thumb too. If you're kind of on the fence onto whether it stays or goes, just write it in. You know, they say, hey, it's already, you know, window coverings are already there. Hey, I like those drapes. I want to make sure those drapes stay. People do that. That's perfectly okay. The TV brackets have caused problems, and not so much that they stay, but when they're removed, it's just a big mess and they don't fix it. It is in the contract that if it is fixed, right here, it's in bold. If they're attached to the walls, floors, or ceilings for the, you know, whether it's for furniture or the TV or whatever, it stays unless you want it removed. And if you do want it removed, check this box, and the seller is responsible to fix the holes and damage, but they don't have to paint. I don't know why that's in there, but it is. So the bottom line on all this, exclusions and inclusions, is be proactive, very proactive. Propane. Anyone sold a house with propane before? Yes, probably. Few of you. If you ever do, is it a rented tank or is it a purchased tank? Is the propane gas personal property, or does it run with the house? If it's a rented tank, it's caused problems. The seller says, I want to sell it. You know, you don't the few $100s, but just be cautious of that sort of thing. I would just write. I learned a lesson. The reason I bring that up, because I was in an area that had a lot of propane, and we just learned to automatically put propane is included. Any leftover propane runs with the house, to avoid that little mess. And keep in mind, you're only dealing with a little small amounts of money, but it creates aggravation at the worst time, which is towards the closing time when everybody's under pressure. Okay.
Back east, we used to run into that with oil in the oil tank.
Yeah.
You know, it's like, well, I just spent $500 filling that tank with oil. It's like, yeah, well, so the people from the oil company used to come out and actually measure how much oil was left in the tank, and it was adjusted for at closing.
Oh, geez. Well, that's it's a real. Sorry, I'm setting my little timer here to make sure we don't go overboard. Yeah, little things like that. And you think, and you don't even, most of the time, it's just not even thought about. That one time, as Kent said, it can be a mess. Okay. Section 9, closing details. Basically, who's going to live there and when does the buyer get the keys? Okay. Starting with closing and possession. It's circled. There's 2 boxes. The buyer intends to occupy the property as their primary residence, or if you check it off, does not intend. How can that make a difference in the type of loan that's approved?
Whether it's considered an investment property or primary residence makes a big difference in terms of, down payment and loan type, etc.
Mm-hmm. And sometimes a buyer is just going to check that box off when there's no intention to do so. That can be lender fraud.
Federal crime, my favorite kind.
Exactly. I don't know. Here's the thing. Actually, before we get to the C on B, seller occupied property or vacant property. Possession delivered to buyer at 6 p.m. Why do you think they put 6 p.m. on the date of close of escrow?
Because
So
there can be delays.
When does it get recorded?
Usually 9 a.m.
Does it ever get recorded later than that?
Oh, yeah.
So, and the reason I ask that is because so many times I know in our office, I see these, they're putting 9 a.m. on the date of close of escrow or 10 a.m. So the buyer is looking for the keys at 10 a.m. and it hasn't recorded yet. Should you give the keys to the buyer if it hasn't recorded yet?
No, you shouldn't. But Mike, I put 10 a.m. because this is also, besides a contract between the buyer and seller, this is instructions to the escrow company.
Mm-hmm.
So it puts heat on the escrow company to get their butt down there at the recording office early in the morning.
Do they?
Most of the time.
Yeah.
I've had them screw up.
One of our TCs who's been around a long time, she's an independent TC, tells me that that's been her pet peeve, because so oftentimes she has to deal with the buyer wanting the keys and it hasn't recorded yet when it was put in, that the earlier time was put in there. So be careful of that. And if it's your strategy and everybody's accepting it and all that, you might want to at least counsel your buyer. You will not get those keys until it records, most likely.
I'm a 1 o'clock guy.
Yeah.
It's like, right, put it in the middle of the day, and hopefully the buyers can have the keys by the end of the day.
I know. Well, in Texas, it's like you go in and you actually sign with your clients, buyer and the sellers. And as soon as the loan funds, that's when the buyer gets the keys. Here you go. And it's at the closing table. Within an hour of everybody signing, it's buyer has the keys and they take off. So it's different market. But here, just be cautious of that piece of it, because it could get a buyer upset at you unnecessarily.
Do they wear their guns into the closing office in Texas, Mike?
Sometimes.
Sometimes.
They do. On UT, actually, they can, believe it or not, University of Texas. Okay, so seller remaining in possession after close of escrow. Does that ever happen? Seller needs a little extra time. Yeah, of course it does. There is a document for that. Okay, and that needs to be executed if it's less than 30 days. If it's more than 30 days, then we need to do basically a residential lease agreement. And I believe if it's 30 days or more, if it's more than 60 days, that's going to be a problem with the loan if it's an owner occupied property. So be cautious and make sure you know all that. Check with your lender, ask your lender, because this can be a problem. And I've seen this happen where the seller, for some reason, if, I'll have the buyer where everything's getting ready and then the seller was never talked to by their agent, and they have an assumption they get a couple days to move out. How can I possibly move out if I don't have my check yet? I mean, yes, that exists. So make sure that you're very clear with the seller at the beginning. And if the seller does need extra time and you know it up front, you may not want to negotiate it at the very end. You may want to have it negotiated at the time of contract with that SIP. Okay. Some buyer agents feel that it's a nice gesture and strengthens their commitment to the seller if they offer time for the seller. Hey, if you need an extra week to move, we're happy to provide it rent-free or for a minimal amount for holding costs, etc. But just be cautious of that piece of the contract. Okay. Tenant occupied property. By default, it needs to be vacant for at least 5 days prior to closing, unless you agree otherwise. If the seller is unable to do so, could be in breach. If the tenant, if it's assumed that the tenant has been agreed to, the tenant will be moving out. This happened about a year or so ago. I got a letter from we had the seller, I think, one of our agents, a year and a half ago actually, and I'm just hearing about it now because everybody's all upset about it way later. The seller told the agent, the listing agent, oh yeah, tenant's gone, don't worry about it. Listing agents relayed that onto the buyer's agent. Buyer agent relayed it onto the buyer. Okay, great, let's close. No final walkthrough because the buyer was out of town. Turns out the tenant was still squatting there. And the buyer had to pay a lot of money to not only get the tenant out, but to repair some damages. That was a problem. So when it is vacant, you need to confirm that. I don't care if you're on the listing side or the buyer side, confirm it physically. Don't take anybody's word for it. Tenant to remain in possession, but that's fine. If that's the case, there's a document for that. And there's other procedures as well. You want to make sure that, the deposits are transferred and, you prorate the rent, all that kind of stuff. But there is a procedure should that happen. And of course, at closing, it's agreed. The seller gives away the keys, the passwords, and all that other stuff. That's at the bottom. Okay. All right. We are moving along to the gritty part of the contract. Okay. Statutory and other disclosures. What does statutory mean?
Required.
Yes, got it. You got the second, yeah, required by law. Okay. Certain exemptions might apply. They never apply to the lead-based paint disclosure. But perhaps for the transfer disclosure statement, they do. For example, if the property is owned by a trust of which no members of the trust have ever lived there, they don't have to provide a TDS. On CAR, there's a chart of exemptions, like a bank-owned property, for example. They don't, and it says what's required in certain types of sales. And so just be aware of those exemptions, but they don't come across that often. Okay. Statutory, okay, what the seller knows, she must disclose. And that applies to you as the agent. If you know something that is not on the disclosures, it is your duty to disclose it. Tell your client about it. Let your client disclose it. Say, put it on an amendment, etc. But if your client refuses, just absolutely refuses to tell you that the garage pulls up every time it rains, it is your duty to disclose that to the other party. All parties, actually. And about those taxes, we're going to get into that too. Just notate this: a lot of real estate lawsuits occur with mismanagement of this section right here. Okay. And the thing about a lawsuit, if you're doing a lot of transactions, a lot of them, it's no matter, you're doing everything perfectly and something goes wrong and it's after the fact, and the seller or the buyer puts a lawsuit out there, guess what? Everybody's in. Everybody's in. Why do you think that is? Why are they going to put everybody in the lawsuit?
Deep pockets.
Deep pockets. And really, because of the insurance, they have E&O insurance. They know they can get a lot. And usually, quite frequently, there's a settlement done, and versus an actual going to court. Most of the time it is. But there's a lot of your time spent. You're going to end up paying a deductible, whatever your arrangement is with the broker. Usually it's the same percent of your split. And so if you're at Keller Williams and you're at 100% split, then you pay 100% of your deductible. So if you've capped, then make sure you get sued. Make sure it's not when you've capped. But it's not but anyway, the thing is, it's not a matter of if you get sued, it's when, because you will eventually get dragged into something if you do enough transactions. Your exposure goes up. Doesn't mean you did anything wrong, but don't do anything wrong. That's the key. And it's so easy not to. It is easy, simple not to do anything wrong, but it's a lot simpler to be lazy and let things go. Go simple, not simpler. Okay. So statutory and other disclosures, okay? This is basically it, so we don't have to read through all those words. Lead-based paint, transfer disclosure statement, the AVID, which is part of the transfer disclosure statement. There's a particular group of team out there in another office who says my office says we don't have to do AVIDs. Not true. The actual knowledge of material fact, that's the statutory disclosure. Melrose, any special assessment that runs with the property, obviously a statutory disclosure. And as it says down here, you cannot waive these statutory or lead disclosures. The only time that they don't have to happen, and that would be sometimes apply to these two, is if it's exempt in the examples that I gave and a couple of other examples. Okay. And there's more. So
Mike, on that lead-based paint one, after 78, do you still need that lead-based paint disclosure?
it is not required, but I recommend it. Why not? It's not going to hurt anything. You might get another agent's going, oh, you don't need this. It's
Yeah, exactly. So what happens when the other agent won't provide it and you provide it to them and they won't even submit it to their seller?
Just have it on record you provided it. If it's really not,
okay,
required, because if there is lead-based paint that's discovered way down the road, you've done your piece. And what I recommend there is if you're going to send it via email, is send that email out and save that and put it in your file.
Or other lead-based hazards, right? So like lead in the soil. Let's say they did new construction, but there was lead in the soil on around the new construction or something like that.
Yeah,
So,
absolutely. Absolutely. And one thing I'm surprised doesn't exist on our documents is the same type of disclosure for asbestos. I don't know of any state that has that. Yeah, I think they don't want to touch that can of worms, but it's not there. But in essence, within the time frame, which is 7 days in paragraph 14, and we'll get to it at some point, the seller, unless they're exempt, has to provide their things, the TDS. The seller property questionnaire is required. And if they are exempt, by the way, there is an instrument, there's a form for everything. There's this one here. It's a buyer with an exempt seller disclosure. There's a document for it, okay? Make sure that gets filed in there. If you just omit it, here's the thing. Let's say you omit it and it's found out, well, you didn't really need it anyway. I mean, we all know the seller's exempt. And let's say there is some kind of litigation that comes up. And you got to remember, you've got the judge up there looking at your entire file. And if things aren't done exactly by the book, what are they going to think? Maybe, especially if you're working for a larger brokerage, they're going to think that's kind of sloppy. So let's look a little closer at what they're doing here. So there's that too. I always imagine every transaction I ever did, I did a bunch of them, is I imagine that my file, first of all, when we went to electronic, I imagine it to be a paper file, right? Is going to be sitting on a desk and I'm looking up and I'm saying, and I'm being asked the question and I'm going to say, yes, Your Honor. So I'm going to imagine that my entire file is in a courtroom. And if you look at it that way, you're going to be really high on the compliance. You're going to think someone like Alex Strive, thank you, Alex, for being so hard on me, for making sure I get all this stuff, even though it's a pain to get sometimes, right? So be cautious of that. Keep in mind later discoveries. Let's say that the TDS and all that is given, and then the seller finds a skeleton in the attic. Somebody died on the property, and it's, I don't know, or just some feature or a leak in the roof that he didn't notice before in the garage. That needs to be provided in writing from the seller. Okay. However, if the inspections discover something the seller didn't disclose, which obviously happens, that doesn't need to be disclosed. Or if that leak in the roof that the seller just saw shows up on the inspection, okay, we all know it now, right? Let's say though, and this does happen where the sellers find things later on, let's say day 20, they find something that wasn't in the inspections and it wasn't in the disclosures, but oh my God, we just found this out, right? The furnace is just blew on me and I can't afford to fix it. So you give them a subsequent amended disclosure. Buyer gets, if the amended disclosure is delivered in person, which is rare, the buyer gets 3 days to decide whether to accept it or negotiate to get it fixed or to cancel and get the deposit back. If it's delivered electronically, which it mostly is through email, they get 5 days to review and then cancel if desired. That's a source of confusion, the 3 day, 5 day thing. 3 day is rare, but they got to hand it to you. 5 days is typical. Any questions? Okay. All right, taxes and all that good stuff. By the way, the NHD is required. Depending on which company you talk to, theirs is the best. So withholding taxes. Now I know the title company collects this stuff as well, but technically the FERPTA form that the seller is obligated to deliver to the buyer, if that's not done, and perhaps the title company doesn't do their job, technically the buyer may be liable to pay those taxes that should have been withheld. And so it is something that needs to be done. I don't believe the FERPTA is necessary if the title company is doing it, but it's still out there. Megan's Law, it's not your duty to disclose or to work with them on that, but they do get a notice that this is where you can find out information. If the buyer wants further information on that, we recommend that you get it from that website during your inspection contingency period. We do not have expertise in this area. Okay. I think we're all familiar with that. If it's a condo, check ahead of time for the HOA docs. If you have the listing, oftentimes you're going to pull them during the listing period. However, be aware that they have a shelf life. So if you have a condo on the market for months and months and months, those documents that you pulled and paid for up front may no longer be valid, but they will contain all of the info, but you're still going to have to order a new copy. But check ahead of time. Oftentimes they are ready and available from the seller. If they are, it's always good to have the buyer look at them before they make an offer on the property. There's little things like the monthly HOA dues. They go, oh my God, $1,200 a month. And late discoveries on the CC&Rs have caused a lot of cancellations. And not just on condos. If you're in a development in the county that's single family residence with an HOA, the CC&Rs could be an issue there. So could the monthly dues. A lot of people say, I'll never live in an HOA. They're telling me I can't park my 57 Chevy on the lawn. You know, are you gonna? No. Or I can't paint my house purple, whatever. And they freak out about things that don't matter. And the best thing is just have them take a drive through the neighborhood and just sort of settle down a little bit and look at the house again. But just be cautious and learn as much of that as you can up front.
Mike, can you talk about the CC&Rs or the rules, regulations, and restrictions, and who's responsible for reading that?
Well, the seller, first of all, needs to disclose right away, okay? And then the seller has to request all of the different documents from the HOA, provide that to the buyer. It's the buyer's responsibility to go through them. It's not your job to go through it with them. It's their job to go through it. Be careful if you do, because if you do go through things with your buyer and you're giving them advice and you miss something, guess whose fault it becomes? So it's basically just get the information, which is ready, which is available. And some HOAs are really slow, and they have like a part-time volunteer who's going to try to get it, and the computer's down. All that kind of stuff happens, right? But just provide the stuff. They read it, and sometimes they don't even care. They just want to know how much it is a month. Typically, say in a condo, for example, the exterior and the landscaping and all that, at least the front yard is typically taken care of by the HOA, but not always. If it's a single family unit, but it's actually a condo development, there's different ones in different areas. So just, they're all unique is the best advice. They're all unique, and they change. And it's
the seller's responsibility to pay for those stocks.
It depends. It depends on how you set up the who pays what, the allocation of costs. Sometimes you put 50-50. Sometimes you want the seller to do it. I would put the seller to do it, but it's negotiable. Negotiable.
Well, what I do with my buyers is I recommend that they use a service to review those docs, because sometimes there's future assessments that come up because they're going to be doing some sort of painting or roofing or something like that, and I don't want them to miss it. So I usually send them to an agency that will actually review those docs for them, and then actually do kind of a report and a summary of what the future entails.
That's good advice that you're giving your people. So keep doing that.
That's a great thing to do.
Very good thing to do.
Yeah, I mean, sometimes, on a review of an HOA's health, it comes clear that, wow, there's really not sufficient funds in case there's a major issue. And invariably, people who have done that from our office and have, given out that advice, like within a year, they've had, $27,000 assessments, or just crazy stuff have come up in some of the little complexes around.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And there are things that could affect the loan. If there's a lawsuit pending against the HOA, for example, you're probably not going to get a loan. Be real tough. Or
Right, and they actually check all of that out, and
Yeah.
that happened to me at a condo in Capitola.
Mhm.
On because I had my clients actually use that service, and they were able to make an educated decision about it. They still bought it, but yeah,
Yeah.
they knew what the future entailed.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And keep in mind too, some of the condo complexes, if a certain too high of a percent of the units are rented, that can affect your loan.
I'll send it to you, Patrick. It's in San Jose.
All right, moving along. Section 11, condition of the property. Everybody knows that every single property on every single contract is always sold as is in its present physical condition as of the date you accept it, correct? Everybody knows that. Subject to the buyer's investigation rights. That's the subject to. Okay. And it states the property, including the pool, spa, etc., and landscaping, lawn, maintain in substantially the same condition as on the date of acceptance. So you look at the property, you write your offer on July 1st, and then you close on August 1st, and the lawn's brown, trees are out, pool's now, after inspections, the pool pump isn't working anymore, that sort of thing. Seller has to deliver it the same way. And all debris and personal property that's not in the sale needs to be removed by close of escrow. That's in the contract. Okay. And has anyone ever had a problem with that? Yes, you have. I know you have. So as is, subject to, get rid of the trash and personal items if you represent the seller. Make sure they know that ahead of time. That includes like sometimes potted plants and things that are just ugly and horrible. Well, the buyers, they're going to love my cactus. Maybe they're not going to love your cactus pots. Of course, the seller must disclose, as it says, disclose any material facts and defects affecting the property, including insurance claims within the past 5 years. And then, and of course, and make any other disclosures required by law, which is filling out the seller property questionnaire and the transfer disclosure statement. But it is the seller's job to do so. And this is anytime you see something all capital or bold, it means it's that way for a reason. Okay. Now, keep in mind the seller may not be aware of all the defects. So when the buyer gets their inspection and it says that the furnace is just not working right, then the buyer, well, boy, the seller should have disclosed that. I wonder what else is wrong that we don't know about. Is that you ever heard that? Probably. But just know that the seller is only going to disclose what they are aware of. Maybe they've never used the furnace in 2 years or whatever the situation might be. Okay. The buyer's job is to check for permits because as it says, the buyer is advised to conduct investigations of the whole property to find out what its condition is. Okay. Property improvements may not be built according to code or in compliance with current law or have had permits issued. It's saying that might be the case. So when the buyer goes, oh, you got to let them know if you have any doubts here. I mean, it's a good practice to just check with the permits, check for them. Now, if you as the agent say, I'll get all that for you, what's the risk?
Liability.
Yeah, liability. So you tell the buyer, you go down to this is where you go, the city office, county office, wherever the case is. Now the buyers have the right to negotiate for repairs or cancel. Seller's under no obligation to even consider anything. But if the buyer takes it as is and then makes discoveries upon the home inspections, etc., they say, wait a minute now, I need to have this fixed, this fixed, this fixed. Now here's the thing. If the seller is aware of things that are wrong, put them in there because, and it's in the transfer disclosure statement, seller property questionnaire, right? Now, who is, and this isn't even custom here in a lot of cases. I don't see it custom, and it really should be. is why wouldn't you have the buyer review all that every time, I know maybe some of you do, before submitting the offer, and then sign off on them. I've got all the information I have. So based on what I see here, maybe I want to adjust my offering price. Because, and from a seller's point of view, you're saying this is the house as is, and this is all the disclosures. So if it says something on there, you say, I'm not going to fix. Why isn't it better that the buyer knows about it ahead of time? And he's going to take it that way? Because if it says, hey, I've got a 25-year-old roof, it hasn't leaked, but it's old, it's at the end of its life. And that's what you get. And it's in the TPS, right? Buyer accepts it as is, whereas all that is aware of it. The buyer's gonna have a really hard time getting that work later on. All right. Okay, back to the investigation of the property. Okay. Obviously, as we know, the buyer's accepting of the property is a contingency of the agreement. What does that mean?
Well, I agree to this transaction, but I got to look the place over.
Absolutely. And it's in the contract that says that. Buyer has the right to inspect, investigate, and test at buyer's expense, unless it's otherwise negotiated. I'm gonna tell you one thing too, and because it just happened. We don't do a lot of sales that have wells and septics, right? So often that's missed at offer time. And then at the end, when it gets time during the inspections, the buyer say, hey, I want the seller to pay for the well tests and inspections. I think the seller should pay to get the septic pumped and inspected and all that. And it's like, no, you didn't address it. Why would the seller do that? It's yours. So just be aware of the outlier properties. They might have different considerations, just like different cities have different considerations. I just wanted to throw that in there. Pest inspection needs to be done by a registered company. Who can define what Section 1 and Section 2 is? I know most of us can, but just be elementary about it.
Section 1 is evidence of active infestation or destruction of wood. Mm-hmm. And Section 2 is conditions that may lead to Section 1 conditions.
Yes. Okay. And one thing that, especially with first-time buyers, when they get that pest inspection, or that wood-destroying organisms, we call it, and they see terminology that says fungus and dry rot, they freak out. Go, oh my God, my house is full of fungus, and they start scratching themselves and all that. And dry rot is the whole place is going to fall down. But if you define ahead of time that, hey, most likely we live near a lot of properties are near the forest, and there's a lot of moisture here, and this stuff happens to any home that's built with wood products. And these are the terms you need. This is what fungus means. It's a white powder, and if it's left untreated, it could end up penetrating the wood and turn to dry rot later on. If it is dry rot, the cure for that is typically to replace those wood members, right? And they go, oh, okay, I get it. So that when they get the report, they're not all freaked out. Too many times we get into the deal, everything's great, let's do our inspections. First time buyer gets the inspections, or maybe the second time buyer that hadn't bought a house in 20 years, and they flip. So it's good to get them a little prepared for those types of terms. Inspect for lead-based paint if it's applicable. Review the buyer inspection advisory. Be satisfied with all matters contained within. We're going to go through that in a minute. Check the sex offender database. It's their responsibility to do so if it's important to them. Would be to me if I had kids. I do have kids. I have 4 of them. Verify property is insurable. Check out the cost of fire and flood insurance. Anyone ever been shocked by the fire insurance lately? The price?
Yes.
Yeah. And if you're
And then I would like to go back to the lead-based paint situation, because I also had a situation where the seller's agent actually went out and bought a lead-based paint test and then wanted to submit his own paragraph saying that he did a test and there was no lead-based paint. And I said, no, I want a reputable source.
Yeah, I wouldn't accept it either. And I think that agent's taking on a lot of liability by doing so as well. So that's poor judgment on that agent's part. And you are right. Do not accept that. You can only do your own inspections. That's my thought. Flood insurance, be cautious too if it's in a flood zone, because it can be, sometimes they won't even issue it. No invasive inspection without written approval or required by law. So if you're looking through this, you say, there might be something behind this wood panel. You can't just tear it off and look behind it unless you get written permission from the seller. But if there is an invasive inspection and there's any damage caused, if it wasn't intended to be invasive, then it's the buyer's responsibility to repair that completely to the condition that it was in. We actually have a situation like that right now, where they were walking through the home. It was an older home, and they're like poking a pencil or something in the bottom of the paneling, and it poked holes in it. Horrible house is probably a tear down, but the seller is like, wait a minute, that's my tear down in my house, and I want it put back in the condition that it was in. Paneling, not drywall. So we'll see how that turns out. So just make sure that if the buyer walks through your house, no touch. Even during the investigation period, just no touch. And most of the inspectors are very well aware of what they can and can't do, and it'll be put in writing if they can't. Okay. In essence, seller needs to make the property accessible to the buyers and to the inspectors during the inspection period. All the utilities have to be on: gas, electricity, etc. All the inspections and reports that the buyer does needs to be shared with the seller at no cost to seller. It doesn't include the appraisal, because that's simply between the buyer and the buyer's lender. But sometimes the seller will ask. And if it's not going to harm the transaction, it's like, your buyer's like, why not? I don't care. But it just depends. It's the buyer's decision on that. Okay.
So can I ask a question here? It says all inspections and reports shared with the seller.
Mm-hmm.
They don't have to, all inspection reports have to be shared with the seller?
That the buyer produces. Home inspection, termite inspection.
That produces to try to negotiate or have things fixed, or just, if they...
Just if, hey, I'm asking you to get this fixed, and based on this inspection. But as it says in the contract, basically, I'll just go through that. Seller at no cost.
Go ahead, Ken.
At no cost, complete copies of all investigation reports obtained by the buyer. Okay, which obligations shall survive the termination of this agreement, which means if there's some new disclosure, the seller has to provide that to the new buyer. But basically, any inspections or items that the buyer gets needs to be provided to the seller.
I'd like to go back to the utility thing, where I just did this transaction where the utilities were on. The stove was disconnected away from the wall. The valve was off. The water valve was off for the house, not the main in the ground, but the water valve. And the agent was refusing to have the sellers make sure that this was operational. Now, the home inspector would not touch it. I would not touch it, because I learned early on, back in like 2001, I turned on the water valve and the pipe broke, and I had to pay for all that water.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So, I don't touch any valves.
Right. No, don't touch anything. We should never touch anything. But yeah, if the stove is unsafe, it's not their job to fix it and make it safe. If it's say, hey, it's disconnected because I'm not sure it works right, then they can have it disconnected. What it says here is operable pilot lights. If it's operable, if it's not operable, they don't need to be on, or gas connected to it. If you have an appliance that's unsafe, if you connect it to water or gas or electricity, then you don't want to have it connected.
Right. Well, it turned out to be okay, but yeah, the thing is, I just want to stress the valve thing.
Sure. And what this is it really tells the seller, and you could cut this out and screenshot and give it to an agent if they're not clear on it, that they can't just say, I don't want to pay the water bill anymore. I'm going to shut the water off, or the gas or the electricity. It has to be on so the buyers can inspect. And, you know, and that's all the way through possession, not just through the inspection period. They can't shut it down unless it's in writing that you both agree. Okay.
We run into that with bank-owned properties sometimes, where they have just these huge amount of disclosures of their own, and get out of all of doing that stuff.
Yes. Bank-owned properties typically will also have you use their contract, and not even this contract. So that gets a little tricky. Okay. So in buyer indemnity and seller protection, the buyer is responsible for any damage caused by the inspectors. So does that ever happen? You know, it'd be like, oh, my refrigerator has a big dent that didn't exist before. The wood floor is all scratched up. Those kind of things. Does that ever happen? Yes. So
Yes, I always take pictures prior to.
yeah, it's almost like you rent a car and they go around and they check it before they. The seller is held harmless for any liability that happens through the inspections, etc. If you get hurt, the inspector gets hurt, whatever, that sort of thing. Okay. And all buyer inspectors must carry proper insurance. So your cousin Bob, who's a handyman, cannot be your home inspector. You need a licensed person with proper liability, workman's comp, other applicable insurance that will defend and protect the seller from liability, etc. So make sure you use reputable inspectors. You know, don't use a reputable home inspector. And if you don't know of any, if you're a KW agent, we got people that do business that will help you and refer you. If you're a non-KW agent, then I'm sure your office has the same thing. But just be cautious of that, because
On that note, you can also ask for a specific bond per house.
You can, absolutely. But just the main point though is just make sure you got qualified people doing it and not cousin Bob, unless cousin Bob happens to be one of our good inspectors. Okay. And we are looking at, okay, this should be our conclusion part of the thing, is the buyer inspection advisory. Okay. We all see this. It's attached to the contract, right? It's checked automatically, and it's, you know, and you can't pull up a contract from zip forms without this coming in, right? So it must be kind of important, but we usually just kind of, here you go, read this, here you go. And kind of that is the point, that they read it. It really is. But should you be prepared to have a trusted advisor conversation about this required form that they just signed? Or is it acceptable to say, I'll just go ahead and read it. Everything you need is in there. The language itself is 5th grade level, so you should be able to understand it. I'm not going to tell you anything about it. You might, you know, there'll be something in here that explains that you kind of aren't supposed to do any consultation on this document, but they're going to ask you some questions, because this form contains a lot of information. But it's 3 parts. First of all, it just tells you the importance of investigating your property. And the first line is that the physical condition is not guaranteed by anyone, seller or broker. It says it's your job, your duty to protect yourself. And that includes discovery with everything from the physical condition of the property to the legal considerations to zoning to everything. And by the way, you're going to get a bunch of stuff, seller, you know, the statewide buyer seller advisory, all kinds of stuff. But this is the one that's required. And it also states that a physical general, like a home inspection, does not cover every part of the property. Because some people think, oh, I got a home inspection, I'm good. Not true. I used to tell people, I lived in an area with older homes as well, years, you know, before I first got into real estate. And I would say, you know, I'm going to order these inspections on your behalf. A home inspection, a termite inspection, a roof inspection, an HVAC inspection, and a chimney and fireplace inspection. And the first question is, how much is that going to cost me? Well, it's going to cost you about $1,100, but it's a good investment because I'd rather have you spend $1,100 and pull out because you found too much wrong and we can't negotiate it than to move in and not know and have all these, you know, tens and maybe hundreds of thousands of dollars. But I made sure they knew that, and they almost always did all of those inspections. Some people are afraid of the roof inspection because the roofer's just trying to get a roofing job. They're just, you know, you cannot over inspect. And if you've ever read this form, you'll see that. Broker obligations, it says right here, this is a CYA statement. We do not have expertise in all areas and therefore cannot advise you on many items, such as those listed below, such as this entire document, right? If broker gives you referrals to professionals, broker does not guarantee their performance. If I refer an electrician to you, this is a guy, I've worked with him, the offices work with him, you know, other offices work with him. He's always been good, but, you know, give him a call and see what you think. And he's good pricing. And then he blows it, he screws up. You're not guaranteeing that. They can't come back to you for that. Then it says you are strongly advised to investigate the condition and suitability of everything, including but not limited to the following, which is everything in the document itself. If you don't, you're acting against the advice of brokers. As you can see, inspection's a big deal, as we all know. We all know that. So the first half of it, basically, as you can see, there's a lot of stuff, the general condition of the property, and it just itemizes it down from the foundation to the roof to the plumbing, heating, AC, electrical, mechanical, security, pool, spa, cracks, leaks, blah, blah, blah. And then it gets into the square footage, the age of the home, the boundaries, says the square footage may not be accurate. You know, we don't know how old these improvements are. Things are approximations only. If you do get a number, if it says it's 1,800 square foot, it's approximation. Hasn't been verified by the seller and cannot be verified by brokers. Okay. Termite, wood destroying pests, soil stability could be an issue. Water utilities, if there's a well, sewage or septic is the waste disposal, obviously. Environmental hazards could be asbestos. This is where it's addressed. Radon, methane, other gases. Earthquakes and flooding could be something to know. Is this an earthquake zone? Fire hazard and insurance, all the different insurance companies that might be out of range. And on this, do you see how buyers may get a little nervous? And they're only halfway through the form, right? And keep in mind, they're reading this. They're reading this. So they're going, okay. A seasoned buyer is going, okay, this is just another document. But second part, building permits, zoning, and government requirements. If rental property restrictions, you know, if they're purchasing that type of a property. Security and safety. Some areas may, not so much here, but things like fences around swimming pools, hot tubs, that sort of thing could apply there. Neighborhood conditions. This is kind of like a condensed version, very condensed version, maybe with more detail than the statewide buyer seller advisory. And essentially, as we said, it familiarizes a buyer with the value of property inspection and investigation. It's not meant to scare them. It's like it's like this. You haven't been to a doctor in 5 years. You go to the doctor and are you feeling okay? And the doctor says, or the doctor asks you that, you say, yeah, I feel fine. Nothing's wrong. And the doctor says, well, okay, good. I'm glad you're feeling okay. These are all the things that could be wrong with you though, even if you feel okay. You know, and it goes down the list. You could have a brain aneurysm. You could have cancer. You could have the flu. You could have appendicitis. You could have all, and he goes down every little detail of every part of your body, starting with your eye, ears, nose, and throats all the way down. It could freak you out. They don't do that, but we do. So
I just want to jump in there and just say that that's another sort of argument for or impetus to send a copy of the RPA over to your buyers before you get close to doing a contract, just so that they have had time to sort of digest all of this information and sort of go through what sort of questions they have. So when it's time to actually write the offer, there's no big surprises there.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Absolutely. And if that's not possible, during your discussions with them, when you're not talking about the property they're looking at, it's, you know, talking about pieces of it, at least discussing it. I like that's what Kent just mentioned is ideal. But yeah, you don't, if you just throw them a curveball like this, I mean, people, this document here has scared people away. If that, you know, that have no clue, they go, oh my God, all that stuff could be wrong. And they think, I got to inspect all that, you know? And so they have to just get it in perspective. Get it in perspective. Okay. We're about at the end of our time here. Next week, when we do this, we're going to talk about one of the things we'll talk about is the one section of the contract that you as a realtor need to be an absolute 100% expert in, and you need to know it backwards, inside out, this section. Because it is the one area where we have the most confusion, and it also is, it's where most deals fall apart within this section of the contract we're going to go through next week. So please make it a point to be there for that. And but for today, I want to stop at this point because the next section is going to take a little while, and we'll start up with that